My name is Camilla. I'm 28 and I'm standing in my childhood bedroom watching my life disappear into cardboard boxes. Just 3 days ago, my father's new wife Diane looked me straight in the eyes and told me to pack up and leave the only home I've ever known. The worst part? My dad just stood there in silence, choosing her over me. Somehow, overnight, I went from being family to an unwanted guest under my own roof. But this story isn't about how I lost my home. It's about how I exposed Diane's true nature and fought to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to hear how I stood up for myself when my entire world came crashing down. I grew up in a cozy 2-story colonial house in the suburbs of Minneapolis, Minnesota. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was filled with love and laughter. My parents, Howard and Laura, created a warm and nurturing environment for me. My mom was a kindergarten teacher with endless patience and creativity, while my dad worked as an accountant at a local firm. They complemented each other perfectly, mom with her spontaneity and dad with his steady reliability. Some of my fondest memories were our Sunday morning pancake breakfasts. Dad would wake up early and create these elaborate animal-shaped pancakes. I would guess what each one was supposed to be, and he'd pretend to be offended when I couldn't tell his giraffe from his horse. Mom would sit at the kitchen island, coffee in hand, laughing at our silly game. The backyard was Mom's domain. She had the most amazing garden that bloomed from early spring through late fall. She taught me everything about plants, from how deep to plant the seeds to which flowers attracted butterflies. We spent countless hours together, hands in the dirt, talking about everything and nothing at all. Every summer, we would pack up our old station wagon and drive up to Lake Superior for a week of camping. Dad would spend days before the trip checking all our gear and planning the route, while Mom and I would be in charge of snacks and entertainment. Those nights around the campfire, listening to Dad tell slightly scary stories while Mom snuggled next to me in our shared blanket, were perfect. Everything changed when I was 16. Mom started feeling tired all the time, and at first we all thought it was just stress from the school year. But when she found a lump during a self-exam, our world turned upside down. The diagnosis was devastating. Stage 3 breast cancer already spreading to her lymph nodes. The next year became a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. I watched my vibrant, energetic mother transform into someone who needed help getting out of bed. Dad tried to stay strong, but I would sometimes find him crying quietly in the garage where he thought no one could hear him. I took on more and more household responsibilities. Between school cooking meals, cleaning the house, and helping care for Mom, I grew up fast. Too fast, probably. But I never complained. How could I when Mom was fighting so hard? There was one evening about 2 months before she passed when Mom and I had a moment alone. Dad had gone to pick up her prescriptions and she was having a rare good day. "Camilla," she said, patting the spot beside her on the bed, "I need you to listen carefully." I sat down, trying to ignore how thin she'd become, how her wedding ring slid loosely on her finger. "This house is your home always," she said. "No matter what happens, remember that this is where you belong. I've made sure of it." I didn't fully understand what she meant then. I just nodded and held her hand, promising that I would remember. Mom passed away 3 weeks before my 17th birthday. The house that had once been filled with laughter became eerily quiet. Dad retreated into himself, going through the motions of life, but not really living. He would go to work, come home, eat whatever I had prepared, and then sit in his recliner staring at the television until bedtime. I did everything I could to keep our home running. I learned how to pay bills, schedule maintenance for the house, and even took over Mom's garden, though my attempts were amateur at best. All while finishing high school and preparing for college. When it came time to decide on universities, I chose the local state college, even though I had been accepted to several out-of-state schools with better programs for graphic design. I couldn't leave Dad alone. We had an unspoken agreement that we would get through this grief together, and that meant staying close to home. So I lived at home through college, commuting to campus each day. Gradually, Dad and I established a new normal. It wasn't the same vibrant household it had once been, but we found comfort in our quiet routines. Sunday pancakes became Sunday bagels. The garden became simpler but was still maintained. We still took a trip each summer, though we stayed in cabins instead of tents. Through it all, there was an understanding between us. This house was our sanctuary, our connection to Mom and my forever home for as long as I needed it to be. 7 years passed since Mom's death. I had graduated college, started my career as a graphic designer at a small marketing firm in the city, and was slowly building my client list for freelance work on the side. At 27, I was still living at home, but it made sense for both of us. I paid my share of the expenses, helped maintain the property, and Dad and I had settled into a comfortable coexistence. The first signs of change were subtle. Dad started paying more attention to his appearance. He got a new haircut, updated his wardrobe, and I even caught him using cologne one morning. I was happy to see these changes, thinking that maybe he was finally emerging from the cloud of grief that had surrounded him for so long. Then he mentioned joining a bowling league with some colleagues from work. This was huge, as Dad hadn't been interested in social activities for years. Every Thursday night, he would head out with his bowling bag and return a few hours later, usually in a better mood than when he left. About 3 months into this new routine, I started hearing him mention someone named Diane. It was casual at first, just comments like, "Diane brought homemade cookies to the office today," or "Diane recommended this new restaurant." I was cautiously optimistic. Dad deserved happiness, and if this Diane person was bringing a spark back into his life, I was all for it. I didn't pry, knowing that Dad would share more when he was ready. That moment came on a Friday evening when Dad asked if I would be home for dinner on Saturday night. "I'd like you to meet someone," he said, his eyes focused on straightening the mail on the counter rather than looking at me. "A friend from work, Diane." The dinner was awkward, to say the least. Diane arrived precisely at 6:30, carrying a store-bought apple pie and wearing a perfume that was just a touch too strong. She was attractive for her age, mid-40s, with carefully highlighted blonde hair and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Camilla, I've heard so much about you," she gushed, pulling me into an unexpected hug. "Howard talks about his talented daughter all the time." Throughout dinner, I noticed little things about Diane that made me uneasy. The way she would touch Dad's arm possessively when she laughed. How she referred to certain features of our home as things she would do differently. The subtle way she redirected conversations back to herself whenever I was speaking with Dad. Over dessert, she mentioned her 2 children from her previous marriage. Aiden is 15, just started high school and already on the varsity baseball team, and my Zoe is 12, absolute genius with mathematics. You'll have to meet them soon. The way she said it with such certainty that there would be more meetings, more integration into our lives, sent a small chill down my spine. But I pushed the feeling aside, reminding myself that Dad's happiness was what mattered. In the months that followed, Diane became a regular presence in our home. What started as weekend visits quickly evolved into spending most nights. Each time she stayed over, small changes appeared around the house. A new throw pillow on the couch, different hand towels in the bathroom, a scented candle that Mom would have hated because of her sensitivity to artificial fragrances. Dad and I had always had Sunday morning breakfast together, a tradition that had survived even after Mom's passing. Now Diane was there too, suggesting we go out for brunch instead, or preparing elaborate meals that left the kitchen in disarray. I tried to adapt. I really did. I even made an effort to connect with Diane one afternoon when Dad was at a work conference. I suggested we could work together on replanting some areas of the garden for spring. Her response was telling. "Oh, honey, I was thinking we could just hire a landscape service to completely redesign the yard. This garden is so dated, and it must bring up sad memories for you and Howard." That garden was one of the few living connections I still had to my mother. The idea of bulldozing it for some trendy new design made my stomach turn. The first time Aiden and Zoe visited was eye-opening. They arrived with overnight bags and immediately claimed spaces in our home as if they owned them. Aiden dropped his gaming console in front of the living room TV and proceeded to play at full volume. Zoe wandered into my room without asking and began examining my art supplies and personal belongings. "Your room is so big," she commented. "Much bigger than mine at home." At dinner, they complained about the food I had prepared, a lasagna recipe that had been a family favorite for years. "Mom makes it with more cheese," Aiden said, pushing his plate away. "And less vegetables," Zoe added, making a face. What shocked me most was Dad's response. Instead of his usual gentle reminder about being grateful for meals prepared by others, he jumped up and offered to make them sandwiches instead. Later that evening, I overheard Zoe commenting on our family photos in the hallway. "These are so old, and there are so many. We should put up some pictures of us too." Diane's reply was soft but clear. "Don't worry, sweetie. We'll make some changes soon enough." That night, I called my best friend Taylor and poured out my concerns. "Am I being selfish?" I asked her. "Should I be more supportive of Dad finding happiness?" Taylor's response was measured. "It's not selfish to feel displaced in your own home, Cam. But maybe this is just an adjustment period. Give it some time and see how things develop." I tried to follow her advice, but each week brought new challenges and the growing sensation that I was becoming a stranger in my own home. 6 months after I first met Diane, Dad called me into the living room for an important family discussion. I found him sitting on the couch, Diane pressed closely to his side, both wearing expressions that immediately put me on edge. "Camilla, we have wonderful news." Dad said, his smile nervous but genuine. "Diane has agreed to marry me." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Wow, that's fast," I managed to say. "But congratulations." "We know it seems quick." Diane jumped in her hand, tightening around Dad's arm. "But when you know. Right, Howard?" Dad nodded, looking at Diane with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it love? Or something more complicated? I forced myself to be supportive. This was Dad's decision, and if Diane made him happy, then I needed to accept that. So I offered to help with wedding planning, even creating custom wedding invitations as my gift to them. "That's sweet of you, Camilla," Diane said when I presented my initial designs. "But I've already ordered invitations from this boutique in the city. They specialize in second wedding aesthetics." It was the first of many rejections. Despite my efforts to be involved, Diane systematically excluded me from key decisions. She would schedule cake tastings when she knew I had work deadlines. Venue visits happened during my regular yoga class. And whenever I entered a room where she and Dad were talking wedding plans, their conversation would abruptly change topics. One evening, I came home early from work and overheard Diane on the phone in the kitchen. "Finally making this house a proper home," she was saying. "It's been stuck in a time capsule since his first wife died. So depressing." My blood ran cold. This house was filled with carefully preserved memories of my mother. Yes, some of the decor was dated, but it was ours. Our history, our comfort. The conversation continued as I stood frozen in the hallway. The daughter, yeah, still living at home. At her age. Can you imagine? "Don't worry. I have plans for that situation too." I retreated to my room, heart pounding. When I tried to talk to Dad about my concerns later that week, he was evasive. "Diane just wants to freshen things up a bit, Camilla. Change is good, right?" "Dad, this is more than changing throw pillows. She's talking about completely redoing Mom's garden, replacing furniture, and I heard her telling Zoe that my bedroom would make a perfect playroom." He looked uncomfortable but shook his head. "You must have misunderstood. Diane knows this is your home too." But as the wedding approached, more concerning comments slipped through. During a discussion about the guest list, Diane referred to her children as Howard's new family. When I questioned her phrasing, she laughed it off. "Oh, you know what I mean. We're all going to be one big happy family soon." The wedding itself was a small affair held at a local country club just 3 months after the engagement announcement. Everything felt rushed, as if Diane was racing toward some invisible finish line. Throughout the ceremony, I stood off to the side while Aiden and Zoe were prominently featured. Aiden as the ring bearer despite being 15 years old and clearly embarrassed by the role. Zoe as the flower girl wearing a dress that nearly outshone Diane's cream-colored suit. Dad looked nervous during the vows, his voice slightly shaky. But he smiled when Diane squeezed his hand, and I tried to be happy that he had found someone after being alone for so long. During the reception, I was helping the caterers bring out the cake when I overheard a conversation between Diane and a woman who looked remarkably similar to her, likely her sister. "How long before you get that house properly sorted out?" the woman asked. "Give me 3 months," Diane replied with a smirk. "The daughter is the only complication, but Howard will come around to my way of thinking. He always does." I nearly dropped the stack of dessert plates I was carrying. That night, after the small gathering had ended and the newlyweds had departed for a weekend getaway at a nearby resort, I returned to an eerily quiet house. Walking through the living room, I noticed something missing. The large family portrait that had hung over the fireplace showing Mom, Dad, and me at my high school graduation was gone. In its place was a generic landscape painting I had never seen before. I searched the entire house and finally found the portrait stuffed behind the washing machine in the laundry room, the frame cracked. It was the first tangible sign of what was to come. The invasion began the weekend after Dad and Diane returned from their honeymoon. A moving truck appeared in our driveway early Saturday morning, loaded with furniture boxes and personal belongings for Diane and her children. I had spent the week mentally preparing myself for the changes determined to be accommodating and positive. But nothing could have prepared me for the systematic takeover that followed. Diane directed the movers with military precision, pointing out where her furniture would replace existing pieces. "That old couch can go to the basement," she instructed, referring to the comfortable sectional where I had spent countless hours reading and watching movies with Dad. "And this china cabinet goes where that bookshelf is." By Sunday evening, the house was transformed. Family photos had been replaced with portraits of Diane and her children. Mom's carefully collected antique teacup collection had been boxed up and relegated to the attic to make room for Diane's modern glass sculptures. Even the refrigerator had been cleared of my meal planning calendar and shopping lists replaced with Zoe's school schedule and Aiden's sports commitments. Most distressing was what happened to Mom's garden. While I was at work on Monday, Diane had a landscaping crew come in and dig up the perennial beds that Mom and I had nurtured for years. The beloved rose bushes, the hydrangeas that bloomed in the exact blue shade that Mom had adored, all gone. In their place was a sterile arrangement of low-maintenance shrubs and stone pathways. When I came home and saw the destruction, I couldn't hold back my tears. Dad found me sitting on the back steps crying silently. "Camilla, I know it's a big change," he said, sitting beside me, but not quite close enough to touch. "But Diane thought the garden required too much maintenance." "Did you even try to stop her?" I asked, my voice breaking. "That garden was Mom's. It was ours." Dad looked at the transformed backyard, his expression unreadable. "We have to move forward, Camilla. We can't live in the past forever." It felt like a betrayal of everything we had shared during those years after Mom died. We hadn't just been living in the past, we had been honoring her memory while still building our lives. Inside the house, the territorial battle continued. Aiden had completely taken over the living room, his gaming equipment permanently connected to the television. Any attempt to use the space was met with teenage attitude and complaints to Diane, who would then suggest I use my laptop in my bedroom instead. Zoe had no concept of personal boundaries. She would enter my room without knocking, borrow my art supplies without asking, and once even wore one of my favorite blouses, returning it with a stain down the front. "Kids will be kids," Diane said dismissively when I brought up the issue. "You need to be more understanding, Camilla. They're adjusting to a new home." But it wasn't just the kids. Diane herself engaged in a subtle but persistent campaign of microaggressions. She would rearrange the dishes I had just washed, claiming they weren't clean enough. She would comment on my cooking, suggesting it was too spicy or too bland. Family dinner conversations revolved around Aiden and Zoe's activities with little interest shown in my work or life. Dad became increasingly withdrawn during this time. He would come home from work, greet everyone briefly, and then retreat to his home office until dinner. After meals, he would either return to work or sit quietly watching whatever Aiden had chosen on television. The man who had been my partner in grief, who had slowly rebuilt his life alongside mine, seemed to be fading away. One Saturday morning, I went to the garage looking for some old art supplies I had stored there. Instead, I found boxes of my childhood memorabilia, including photo albums, school projects, and even awards I had won, all haphazardly packed as if for disposal. That afternoon, I tried to have a rational conversation with Diane about boundaries while Dad was out running errands. "I understand this is a period of transition," I began, trying to keep my voice level. "But I feel like my space and my belongings aren't being respected." Diane's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment. "The problem, Camilla, is that you're resistant to change. Howard is trying to build a new life, a new family, and you're holding him back by clinging to the past. I'm not holding anyone back, I protested. This is my home too. Is it? She asked, her voice taking on a harder edge. You're 28 years old. Most people your age have their own places. I think you're financially dependent on your father, and that's not healthy for anyone. Before I could respond to this unfair assessment, she walked away, ending the conversation on her terms. The final confrontation came 3 days later. I was working from home, finishing a design project in my bedroom, when my door swung open without a knock. Diane walked in, followed by Zoe, who was bouncing excitedly. "We've been discussing the room arrangements," Diane announced, looking around my space with calculating eyes. "Now that we're settled, we really need to address the bedroom situation. Zoe needs her own room, and this space would be perfect once we redecorate." I stared at her, unable to process what she was suggesting. "This is my room. It's always been my room." "Camilla," she said with exaggerated patience, as if speaking to a child, "it's time for you to pack up and find your own place. You're a grown woman, and Howard and I need to focus on raising our family without complications." Zoe was already pointing to corners of the room, planning aloud. "My bed can go there, and we can paint the walls purple, and I can have a desk by the window." I looked past Diane to see Dad standing in the hallway, his face a mixture of discomfort and resignation. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Dad," I said, my voice small, "is this what you want?" He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Diane thinks it might be best for everyone. We can help you find an apartment." In that moment, I realized I had lost not just my home, but my father too. Without another word, I grabbed my laptop and car keys, brushed past them, and left the house. I drove to Taylor's apartment, tears blurring my vision, feeling as if the ground had completely disappeared beneath my feet. Somehow, overnight, I had gone from being family to an unwanted guest in my own home. For the next week, I stayed on Taylor's fold-out couch, trying to process what had happened. Sleep was nearly impossible. I would lie awake, replaying every interaction, wondering how I had missed the signs that my father was willing to push me out of my childhood home for his new wife. During the day, I went through the motions of work, grateful that most of my design projects could be completed remotely. In the evenings, I would sit with Taylor, sometimes talking through my feelings, other times just staring blankly at whatever show she had playing on television. "You need to get your things," Taylor reminded me gently on the 6th day. "You can't leave everything you own in that house." She was right, of course. So I texted Dad asking when would be a good time to collect some of my belongings. His response was typical of his new distant self. "Tomorrow afternoon would be fine. Diane and the kids have a school function." When I arrived at the house the next day, I was unprepared for what I found. The door to my bedroom was open, and inside the walls were already being painted a bright purple. My bed had been disassembled and propped against one wall. Boxes containing my clothes and personal items were stacked haphazardly in the hallway. Dad emerged from his office when he heard me come in. "Camilla," he said, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness, "I packed some of your things to make it easier." "You let them start painting. I've only been gone a week, Dad." He looked at the half-painted room and shrugged. Zoe was excited about having her own space, and Diane thought it would be good to get the transition moving along. "Transition," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling this, me being kicked out of my home?" Dad's expression hardened slightly. "This isn't productive, Camilla. You're an adult now. It's normal to move out. What isn't normal is having all my things packed up without my knowledge or consent," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady, "or having my father choose his wife of 2 weeks over his daughter." I began going through the boxes, quickly realizing that several important items were missing, most notably the jewelry box containing pieces that had belonged to my mother. "Where's Mom's jewelry?" I asked, a new panic rising in my chest. Dad looked genuinely confused. "It should be with your things, in your dresser drawer." "It's not here," I insisted, dumping out a box of miscellaneous items from my room. "And my dresser has already been moved out." As if summoned by our raised voices, Diane appeared at the front door, returning earlier than expected. She assessed the situation with cool efficiency. "Is there a problem?" she asked, hanging her purse on the new coat rack that had replaced the antique hall tree Mom had refinished years ago. My mother's jewelry is missing, I said directly. It was in my room and now it's gone. Diane's expression remained neutral. I haven't seen any jewelry. Perhaps you misremembered where you kept it. I know exactly where it was, I insisted. In the wooden box with the rose carving on top in my top dresser drawer. Dad stepped between us, his discomfort obvious. I'm sure it will turn up, Camilla. We can look for it later. At that moment, Aiden and Zoe came through the door behind Diane. Zoe was animatedly describing something to her brother, gesturing with her hands. Around her neck was a delicate gold chain with a small sapphire pendant, a necklace I recognized immediately as one that had belonged to my mother. That's Mom's necklace, I said, pointing at Zoe. Why is she wearing Mom's necklace? Zoe's hand flew to the pendant. Mom gave it to me. She said I could have it. I looked at Diane, who met my gaze unflinchingly. It's just an old necklace, Camilla. Howard said it was fine for Zoe to have it. We didn't think you'd mind since you have so many other things from your mother. The casual dismissal of my mother's belongings, the ease with which they had been redistributed without my knowledge, was the final straw. I felt something break inside me. That necklace was a gift from my father to my mother on their 15th anniversary, I said, my voice rising. It's not just an old necklace, and it's certainly not yours to give away. Dad tried to intervene again. Camilla, please calm down. No, I will not calm down, I replied, tears now streaming freely. You've let them take everything. My home, my space, my mother's memory. Where does it end? Dad? What else are you willing to give away? I grabbed the boxes containing my clothes and laptop, leaving the rest for another time. As I stormed toward my car, the neighbors across the street, Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins, were working in their front yard. They had been friends with my parents for decades, and Mrs. Jenkins looked up with concern as I threw the boxes into my trunk. Camilla, she called out. Is everything all right, dear? I couldn't even respond. I just shook my head, got into my car, and drove away, tears blurring the road ahead of me. Later that evening, my doorbell rang. Taylor answered it and returned with Mrs. Jenkins, who had brought a casserole and a sympathetic ear. I've been watching what's going on over there, she said once we were settled in Taylor's small living room. Something isn't right with that woman. Mrs. Jenkins went on to share what she had observed over the past few months. She had overheard arguments between Diane and my father, including one where Diane had threatened to leave if he didn't handle the situation with Camilla. She had noticed expensive deliveries arriving at the house, new furniture and electronics that seemed excessive. Most disturbing, she had done some community research of her own. Diane had financial problems before she married your father, Mrs. Jenkins confided. My friend Marge works at the bank, and while she couldn't give details, she hinted that Diane had been facing foreclosure on her previous home. This new information put everything in a different light. Was Diane just using my father for financial stability? Was the house the real target all along? As Mrs. Jenkins was leaving, she paused at the door. Check your mother's things carefully, dear. Laura was always very organized and forward-thinking. I wouldn't be surprised if she left instructions somewhere. That night, I remembered a conversation with Mom near the end about things being taken care of. On a hunch, I dug through the few boxes I had retrieved and found an old copy of Pride and Prejudice, Mom's favorite book that she had given to me on my 16th birthday. Tucked inside the back cover was an envelope addressed to me in her handwriting with instructions to open it if I ever felt uncertain about my place in the family home. With trembling hands, I opened the letter and began to read her words written when she knew her time was limited, but her love was not. My dearest Camilla, it began. If you're reading this, something has happened to make you question your security in our home. I want you to know that I have made legal arrangements to protect your future. The letter went on to explain that Mom had established a trust before her death. The family home had been placed in this trust with provisions that guaranteed my right to live there as long as I needed or wanted to. Dad had been made trustee, but his ability to sell or transfer ownership was limited by specific conditions. At the bottom of the letter was a name and phone number for the attorney who had helped set up the trust. With newfound determination replacing my despair, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The next day, I took a personal day from work and began investigating my legal position. My first call was to Mom's best friend Patricia, who had worked as a paralegal for many years at a local law firm. "I was wondering when you might contact me," she said when I explained the situation. "Laura made me promise to keep an eye on things, but I had no idea it had gotten this bad." Patricia invited me to meet her for coffee, where she brought copies of the trust documents my mother had established. As I read through the legal language, the picture became crystal clear. The house was indeed partially mine through the trust. While Dad had been living there and making mortgage payments, the trust specified that I had a lifetime right to reside in the property. Furthermore, any major changes to the property or potential sale required dual consent from both trustees, Dad and a neutral third party, the family attorney. "Your mother was very intelligent," Patricia said, watching me process this information. "She knew Howard might eventually remarry, and she wanted to ensure your inheritance was protected." Armed with this knowledge, I consulted with an attorney of my own, who confirmed my rights and helped me prepare formal documentation to assert them. But I needed more information about Diane herself. Something about her calculated takeover felt practiced, as if she had done this before. Using my design skills, I created a social media profile that wouldn't be easily connected to me and began researching Diane's past. What I found was troubling. Through various community groups and careful keyword searches, I discovered patterns in her previous relationships. Diane had been married twice before, not once as she had told my father. Both marriages had been to men significantly older than her, both with assets. Both marriages had ended within 2 years. In one case, the ex-husband had lost his home in the divorce settlement. I managed to find contact information for her most recent ex-husband, who was initially reluctant to speak with me. When I explained the situation, however, he opened up. "She did the same thing to my daughter," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Pushed her out of the family home, isolated me from my relatives, ran up debt in my name. By the time I realized what was happening, she had already drained my savings account and refinanced the house without my knowledge." He confirmed what Mrs. Jenkins had suspected, that Diane had serious debt problems and a pattern of targeting financially stable men with assets. My attorney advised me to gather documentation of all removed and damaged possessions, particularly items of value like Mom's jewelry. I started compiling photos, receipts, and descriptions, creating a detailed inventory of what had been taken. While developing this evidence, I received an unexpected text message from an unknown number. "This is Aiden. Got your number from your dad's phone. Need to talk to you. Not at the house." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near his school the following afternoon. The sullen teenager who had initially invaded our home was now nervous and fidgety as he slid into the booth across from me. "My mom doesn't know I'm here," he began without preamble. "Look, I know you think I'm a jerk, and maybe I was, but I didn't know what was really going on." Aiden went on to reveal that Diane had been planning a garage sale for that weekend, including many of my remaining belongings and furniture from the house. He had overheard her on the phone describing some of Mom's antiques as easily worth a few thousand. Most disturbing was what he had heard her saying about me to my father. "She tells your dad that you're manipulative and trying to keep him from moving on," Aiden admitted. "She says you're financially draining him and using the house as a free ride." "None of that is true," I said, feeling sick at the thought of Dad believing such things. Aiden nodded. "I figured. Look, my mom, she does this. She did it with my dad, too. Got what she wanted and then everything changed." He hesitated, then added, "Check your dad's financial accounts. That's how she started, with my dad writing checks from his account." This warning prompted me to add another layer to my investigation. Through Patricia, I gained access to bank statements that had been associated with the trust. What I found confirmed my worst fears. In the short time since the wedding, several large transfers had been made from Dad's personal account to an account I didn't recognize. Credit card statements showed significant new debt, with charges for expensive jewelry, electronics, and designer items. Most alarmingly, I discovered that Diane had already contacted a real estate agent about exploring options for selling the house using Dad's email account. With all this evidence in hand, I assembled my support team. Taylor would be there for emotional backup. Mrs. Jenkins agreed to provide her observations of the changes in the household. My attorney prepared the legal documentation asserting my rights through the trust, and Patricia would bring the original trust documents and financial records. We chose a time when we knew everyone would be home a Saturday morning when Diane had planned her garage sale of my belongings. As I parked in front of my childhood home, now nearly unrecognizable with its new exterior paint and landscaping, I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I was standing up not just for myself, but for my mother's wishes and my father's well-being. It was time to reclaim my rightful place and expose Diane for who she really was. The morning was crisp and clear as I walked up the driveway of my childhood home, my small team of supporters flanking me. The front yard was dotted with tables displaying household items, clothing, and furniture, much of which I recognized as mine or as family heirlooms that had been in our home for decades. Diane was directing a young couple examining an antique side table, the one that had sat beside my mother's reading chair for years. Her welcoming smile froze when she spotted me approaching with unfamiliar people. "Camilla," she said quickly, excusing herself from the potential buyers. "What is this? We're in the middle of a sale here." "I can see that," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "You're selling my belongings without my permission." She laughed dismissively. "These are household items that Howard and I decided to clear out. If you wanted them, you should have taken them when you left." "I'd like to speak with my father," I said, refusing to be baited into an argument in the front yard. "Is he inside?" Before Diane could object, I moved past her toward the front door, my attorney and Patricia following closely behind. Taylor and Mrs. Jenkins remained outside, keeping an eye on the sale items. We found Dad in his office reviewing paperwork. He looked up in surprise when we entered without knocking. "Camilla, what's going on? Who are these people?" "Dad, we need to talk," I said, closing the door behind us. "This is my attorney, Mr. Blackwell, and you remember Patricia, Mom's friend." Dad's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Attorney Camilla, what is this about?" Before I could answer, the door swung open and Diane burst in. Her pleasant facade completely dropped. "Howard, they're disrupting the sale. You need to ask them to leave immediately." Mr. Blackwell stepped forward, placing a leather portfolio on Dad's desk. "Mr. Marshall, my name is Andrew Blackwell. I represent your daughter in a matter concerning this property and the Laura Marshall Family Trust." Dad's face paled. "Trust? What trust?" This single question confirmed my suspicion that Dad had either forgotten about or never fully understood the legal arrangements Mom had made before her death. "The trust your late wife established to protect this family home and ensure your daughter's security," Mr. Blackwell explained, opening the portfolio and presenting the documents. Patricia stepped forward. "Howard Laura set this up when she knew she was terminal. You signed these papers in my presence. The house is held in trust with specific provisions for Camilla's right to reside here." Dad looked genuinely shocked as he examined the paperwork, recognition slowly dawning on his face. "I remember signing something, but Laura handled all the legal matters. I didn't realize—" "That's convenient," Diane snapped, trying to see the documents over his shoulder. "Some trust that magically appears just when Camilla decides she wants the house." "There's nothing magical about it," Mr. Blackwell responded calmly. "These documents have been on file with the county for nearly 10 years, and they clearly state that any attempt to sell this property without proper authorization from both trustees constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty." Dad looked up at me, confusion evident in his eyes. "Camilla, I would never sell our home without discussing it with you first." This was my opening. "Are you sure about that, Dad? Because someone using your email account has already contacted Greenfield Realty about listing this house." I placed printed copies of the emails on his desk. Dad read them with growing horror. "I didn't send these. I would never—" Diane's demeanor shifted instantly. "Howard, this is ridiculous. Your daughter is trying to manipulate you just like I told you she would. She can't accept that you've moved on and found happiness." "Is that what this is about, happiness?" I asked, turning to face her directly. "Or is it about money?" I placed another set of documents on the desk, bank statements showing the large transfers from Dad's account. Dad, in the past month, over $50,000 has been transferred from your personal accounts to an account at First National under the name DE Holdings. Do you know anything about that? Dad's face went from confused to shocked as he examined the statements. I didn't authorize these transfers. I don't understand. I can explain, Patricia interjected. DE Holdings is a company registered to Diane Evans, your wife's maiden name. She's been systematically transferring your money into her personal accounts. Diane's face hardened. You have no right to access our financial information. Howard, are you going to let them invade our privacy like this? But Dad was now leafing through the credit card statements I had provided, his expression darkening with each page. A $5,000 watch, designer furniture delivered to an address I don't recognize. Diane, what is this? Before Diane could formulate a response, the office door opened again. Aiden stood there looking nervous but determined. Mom, they're asking about the jewelry outside, the stuff from the locked cabinet in your closet. Diane's eyes flashed with anger. Aiden, go back outside, now! But Aiden didn't move. Instead, he looked at me and said, I found where she keeps the jewelry. The stuff she took from your mom's collection. It's in a locked box in her closet, but I know where the key is. Dad stood up abruptly. Diane, is this true? Did you take Laura's jewelry? Don't be ridiculous, Diane scoffed. I gave a few old pieces to Zoe, nothing valuable. My mother's sapphire pendant is worth over $2,000, I said quietly, and it has immeasurable sentimental value. Dad pushed past Diane and headed for the master bedroom with all of us following. In the walk-in closet, he immediately spotted the cabinet Aiden had mentioned. The key, Aiden. False bottom in her jewelry box on the dresser. Aiden replied, avoiding his mother's furious glare. Moments later, Dad had opened the cabinet to reveal not just my mother's jewelry collection, but also several expensive-looking new pieces with price tags still attached, and a stack of cash bound with rubber bands. Howard, I can explain, Diane began, her tone suddenly placating. I was just keeping these things safe until we sorted out storage. But Dad wasn't listening. He was holding Mom's wedding ring, which I had thought was buried with her. This was Laura's, he said, his voice breaking. We decided she would be buried with it. How do you have this? The color drained from Diane's face. There was no explanation that could justify this. Mr. Marshall, my attorney interrupted gently, there's something else you should know. We've been in contact with Diane's previous husband, who reports a very similar pattern of behavior: financial exploitation, isolation from family, and attempting to sell property without consent. Dad sank onto the edge of the bed, still clutching Mom's ring. He looked at Diane as if seeing her for the first time. Who are you? He asked quietly. Was any of it real? Diane's expression changed completely, calculation replacing her previous anger. Howard, these people are trying to come between us. I love you. We can work this out. But the spell was broken. Dad turned to me, his eyes filled with remorse. Camilla, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Diane must have realized she was losing control of the situation. She straightened her shoulders and shifted tactics. Fine. If that's how you want to play this, I'll be filing for divorce immediately. And I'll be entitled to half of everything, including this house, regardless of any supposed trust. Actually, that's incorrect, my attorney interjected. The premarital assets protected in the trust are excluded from any divorce proceedings. Additionally, given the evidence of financial exploitation and fraud, you may be facing criminal charges rather than a simple divorce. The next hour was a blur of activity. Diane was asked to leave the property temporarily while we sorted things out. She refused at first until my attorney mentioned the possibility of involving the police regarding the unauthorized financial transactions. This isn't over, she hissed at me as she gathered some personal items. You'll regret this. Aiden surprisingly chose to stay sitting quietly in the kitchen while the adults dealt with the aftermath. Zoe had been at a friend's house during the confrontation, and arrangements were made for her to stay there temporarily. Once Diane had left, Dad collapsed into his recliner, looking older and more broken than I had ever seen him. I was such a fool, he said, staring at the unfamiliar decor that now filled our living room. I let her push you out of your own home. I let her erase Laura's memory. You were lonely, I said, sitting across from him. She took advantage of that. The next days were difficult. Dad insisted I move back into the house immediately, taking the guest room while we worked on restoring my bedroom to its original state. Diane made several attempts to return, alternating between threats and tearful pleas, but Dad remained firm, especially after meeting with the attorney to understand the full extent of her financial manipulations. Security locks were changed, and financial accounts were frozen, and new ones established. Mom's jewelry and other family heirlooms were carefully cataloged and secured. The items from the aborted garage sale were brought back inside, though many things had already been sold before we arrived. Dad and I maintained separate living arrangements within the house at first. The trust and betrayal couldn't be erased overnight. We both began therapy individually at first to process what had happened and how we had arrived at such a painful place. The legal proceedings were complicated. Diane did file for divorce, making extreme claims about her contributions to the household and her entitlement to assets. But the evidence of financial exploitation was overwhelming, and her history of similar behavior with previous husbands eventually led to a settlement that protected most of Dad's assets and all of the trust property. Most of the unauthorized transfers were reversed, though some money was never recovered. The expensive items Diane had purchased were returned or sold to recoup costs. It was a financial setback for Dad, but not a devastating one. Aiden reached out to me about a month after everything happened. I wanted to say sorry, he said when we met for coffee, for being such a jerk when we first moved in, and for not saying something sooner about what my mom was doing. You're a kid, Aiden, I told him. It wasn't your responsibility to police your mother's behavior. She's done this before, he admitted. With my dad and with the guy before your father. I should have recognized the signs. Aiden decided to move in with his biological father, who had been fighting for more custody for years. Zoe eventually joined him, though the transition was harder for her as she had been more deeply influenced by Diane's materialistic values. Surprisingly, 6 months later, I received a letter from Zoe. I'm sorry I wore your mom's necklace, she wrote in careful handwriting. My mom told me it was just old jewelry no one wanted. I didn't know it was special. The letter went on to explain that she and Aiden were adjusting to life with their father and that she was seeing a counselor to help understand her mother's behavior. It was a small olive branch, but a meaningful one. As for Diane, we later learned that she had already moved to another state and was reportedly dating a recently widowed business owner. I considered warning him, but decided against direct involvement. Instead, I anonymously sent copies of the legal proceedings to his family members, hoping they might recognize the warning signs before history repeated itself. 1 year after the confrontation, Dad and I hosted a small gathering in the backyard. We had worked with a gardener to restore elements of Mom's original garden design, incorporating some new plants, but honoring her vision. The house had been gradually returned to a balance of old and new, keeping Mom's memory alive while allowing for fresh energy. Dad and I had found a new relationship, one based on honesty and mutual respect, rather than shared grief. Our weekly therapy sessions had helped us communicate better than we ever had before. As guests mingled around the garden, Dad approached me with a small box. I've been waiting for the right time to give you this, he said. Inside was Mom's sapphire pendant, cleaned and restored with a new, stronger chain. She would want you to have it now, he said as he helped me put it on. And she would be so proud of how you stood up for yourself, for our family. Later that evening, after everyone had left, I sat alone in the garden, touching the pendant and reflecting on everything that had happened. The house behind me was truly home again, a place where both memories and new beginnings could coexist. I had learned painful but valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation, setting boundaries, and fighting for what was rightfully mine. Most importantly, I had learned that family isn't just about blood or legal ties, but about respecting and protecting one another through both good times and bad. So if you've ever felt pushed aside or made to feel like a stranger in your own home, remember that you have the right to stand your ground. Family means belonging, not being erased or replaced when someone new arrives. Have you ever had to defend your place in your family? Share your story in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that they deserve to belong. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the family we fight for is the one worth keeping.